companies were not
wanting
to invest in full-time employees. So looking at how can they more effectively use.
So I did do a little bit of research,
and
I was
people and bring those special skills as
and how
they
you
need
thrive
them.
in this
Where does
brave
this come
new world.
from? Where does it start?
Welcome to Crosstalk today. On the show, Luke Tolbert, Nicola Matson, Scott Hayhoe and myself, Martin Rover Parks. In this episode, we're going to talk about millennials. Do they need feedback 4 times a day? Do they need hugs 4 times a day? Are they that fragile?
Those are great questions. And I don't really know about the hugs. Maybe we'll cover that a bit later. But this is kind of a big deal. According to the US Bureau of Labor, by 2030, 75%, an almost incredible 75% of the workforce will be made up of millennials. According to Manpower Group, it's a slightly more conservative 35% by 2020. Whatever the figure for your organisation, whatever it is in your area, whatever you believe, you really can't ignore this. So today we're going to be exploring what this means for businesses and business leaders, starting with, does a need for instant gratification mean millennials really need feedback 4 times a day? We'll go through that in a bit more detail. Do they have the commitment and resilience to deal with the realities of the modern working world? And finally, can they build the sorts of successful relationships they need in high-performing, multi-generational organisations?
Those are all terrific questions. But firstly, what on earth is a millennial? Apparently I'm one, but doesn't that just stereotype and generalise me? What's the point? Someone tell me something I don't know about me. Nicola.
Oh wow, there's a challenge in only 25 minutes, but maybe what we'll find out on today's Crosstalk is whether you do or do not adhere to the stereotypes of millennials. Let's find out. But I think to answer your question, is it a stereotype? Yes, it is. I guess the broader question is, are stereotypes bad things? Certainly popular perception today is that they are, and that sort of represents in a lot of the definitions that we read. So I read one by Webster that actually ended with an oversimplified opinion, prejudiced attitude or uncritical judgment. So certainly sounded pretty negative to me. And I think that's in part because of what we're seeing, in the world today. There's a lot of negative racial stereotyping. We're getting some negative gender stereotyping. If you just look at the furore caused by the Google engineer James Damore when he published his thoughts on gender differences. And I think we all inherently know that many stereotypes are utterly incorrect. And then some are only correct in the context that we take the words. And a good example of that is this, men are stronger than women. So yes, I'm sure the average man can lift heavier weights in a gym than the average woman. However, women have a better, stronger immune system and tend to live longer. So if we think back to that, men are stronger than women, what is stronger? Is that, is that carrying a heavier shopping bag or not dying? I know which strength I'd prefer to have anyway. But back to this sort of stereotyping, and maybe if we say characterizing instead, I think that's got slightly less negative connotations. It is something that's universal, and by that I mean it exists in every society and every culture, and that's because it's meaningful. It helps us with something. It helps us navigate our social experiences. It's a way for us to meaningfully categorise people, events, situations that we go through in a way that helps us remember them and relate to them, and it actually frees up a bit of our thinking time, because it means we can go into a situation and anticipate what a person might be like, what behaviours may or may not be acceptable to that individual. And there's lots of different ways that we can group these individuals, and we can identify these characteristics that are common within them. And one of the ways that we do that are what we call generational cohorts, of which Millennial is an example. And this is a group of individuals who've been born between a specific date range. And I think the reason there's been quite a lot of focus on this is that those group of individuals have gone through very differing economic, social and historical contexts. And it's something that I think HR have eagerly taken on, these very sort of neatly packaged up stereotypes, as a way to help them manage different age groups in the workforce.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we talk about those different generations and stereotypes, it's really good to talk about the ones that we've got around the table here. So, for example, myself as a millennial, born between the 1980s and mid-1990s. We're seen as innovative thinkers, we're seen as multitaskers, one of the most educated of the generations. Unfortunately, on the not-so-positive side, self-centred, entitled and impatient. I had to write those down because I didn't believe it, but that's what the research said. And a less cited one, but one that I firmly believe in, devilishly good-looking.
Interesting.
Well, it's interesting, actually, I went on to Google and just typed millennials are, and in the top 3 hits, I got lazy and the worst generation.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Ouch, the burn.
necessarily believe any of that is true.
Well, hopefully we'll tackle some of these perceptions in today's crosstalk. But what about the other generations, Nicola?
Yeah, so there's quite a few. So we've got the silent generation. That's people born between 1925 and 1944. Pretty much have entirely left the workforce now. Then we've got the baby boomers, or sometimes called the hippie generation. They were born between World War II and early 1960s, and these were really the first generation to declare a higher priority on work over their personal lives. So they're considered very loyal, very hardworking, very goal-driven, very goal-orientated, very driven, but slightly less technically savvy, maybe less comfortable with change.
I think from the sort of the data range there that you gave, I guess I'm pretty obviously a baby boomer, and I kind of like some of the the things that you said about being loyal and hard-working. Perhaps a little bit less comfortable with being stereotyped. I mean, for me, honestly, people of my generation, stereotyping is about being able to send an email with two hands. Stereotyping.
Oh dear.
Oh wow.
Also hippie. I admit I have worn flared trousers, but never in my life have I worn tie-dye clothing.
So that's a mental image that I'm going to quickly erase from my mind and move back to those generational cohorts. So we've also got the Gen Xers. So this is people who were born between the early 1960s and 1980. They're sometimes referred to as the slacker generation, which I personally take umbrage with because I am a Gen Xer.
It's odd because I thought that was quite fitting, actually.
Really, it's strange you say that because you're a Gen Xer. I know you like to think you're a millennial, but actually you are also a Gen Xer. So what are Gen Xers? This group are considered responsible for sort of creating this concept of a work-life balance, which is probably where that slacker term comes from. They're seen as cynical, pessimistic, individualistic, but also flexible, adaptable and comfortable with technology. And then finally, from a work perspective, we've got the Gen Zers, or sometimes called the iGens. So these were people born after the mid-1990s, and they really probably are the only generational cohort to fully have been born into and grown up into this sort of digital age. So they share a lot of the stereotypical characteristics of millennials. And just to sort of maybe challenge the headline of the crosstalk, as I was doing a bit of research around this topic, I did start to think that maybe actually we should be talking about the Gen Zs and not the millennials.
For me, in a work context, I can't really think about millennials without thinking about technology. Certainly later millennials and Gen Zs especially, thinking about iPhones, social media, that sort of thing. And for me, actually, the different phases of digital adoption, I think, tell us a little bit more about what people's expectations of technology and relationships, etc., in the workplace might be. So, when I separate people into the digital cohorts, we have digital natives. Those are the ones that were born with the technology. So the latter millennials and the Gen Zs, especially, growing up with the internet, the sharing, the instant, instant sharing and liking of things. We've then got digital immigrants, the ones who've completely adopted new technologies and they're very comfortable with it. They've crossed that chasm. Then we've got the digital voyeurs. We all know exactly who they are. They're the people on Facebook who've joined Facebook, but they don't like, they don't share, they don't comment, but they're watching everything you do. And everyone's probably got a relative who does that.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad.
Yeah. And then you've got your digital holdouts. Those are the ones who, and again, I think we all know someone like this. They've got their fingers in their ears, just going la 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 la, hoping it's all going to go away and go back to the way it was before. And then finally, we've got our digitally disengaged. These are the ones who they completely get it. They understand the new technologies and platforms, but they're not adopting, they're not embracing them because of maybe concerns over privacy and what happens with the data and those sorts of concerns.
I think, though, listening to the two of you, and I guess I could pick out from that I'm a baby boomer and probably now a digital immigrant. But maybe there's a third way of thinking about this, which is, where are you in your career, actually? Because, if you think about when I entered the workforce in the mid-1980s, actually we used every single digital channel that was available to us in order to communicate in the workplace. So for me, maybe it's a little bit more about, where are you in your career? Those were the early days for me. And then we all go through a sort of a growth phase, and we become a early career. We then become a seasoned professional, and then we often make a choice to become a leader or a consultant or an advisor.
Yeah.
And the one sort of continuum through that that changes and grows is your own confidence in giving and receiving feedback and acting upon that. So maybe you can put all three together, three different dimensions maybe.
So we have maybe three ways of grouping people. We have the generational, when you were born. We have the technologies that were around that you grew up with or that you've adopted as you've gone through your career or life. And then you have your career/life stages. So possibly here there's a sort of a personalized Venn diagram for each of us around the table and everyone listening that is a sort of a much more, personal classification for each of us.
For those new to Crosstalk, you'll find that whatever the topic of conversation, Luke will invariably bring it back to a Venn diagram.
There's a Venn diagram for every situation, Nicola.
Apparently so.
Super. Well, having listened to what we've said on groupings and the generations and the descriptions of those generations, I'm going to throw out there: are they really useful? I mean, let's challenge today's crosstalk. Do millennials really need feedback 4 times a day?
It sounds like a lot, right? 4 times a day. There are probably people listening to the crosstalk who think, well, if I'm supposed to give feedback 4 times a day to everybody, then when am I actually supposed to get my job done? And it might seem
that is very difficult to get your arms around, isn't it?
It is.
And that's a lot of hugs that you're giving out here, Luke.
Exactly. Yes. Oh dear. But actually, if you think about this, if you think this 4 times a day is bad or an exaggeration, some research done by PwC last year in their Millennials at Work paper actually found that millennials expect rapid progression, a varied and interesting career. Those are things that we know, but also constant feedback. And 51% of those questioned said that feedback should be given very frequently or continually on the job. And actually, every piece of research you read says that actually the expectation is that feedback is continuous and very frequently during the week.
Do you think that sort of need for frequent or constant feedback is some way tied into this perception of millennials needing sort of instant gratification? There's this sort of image of a millennial, posting on Snapchat or Instagram and then desperately on tenterhooks to see if they get a like or see if they get a comment. And I watched an amazing video that I would highly recommend people watch by Simon Sinek all about millennials. Yeah. But one of the things that he talked about is actually the addictive nature of these social media applications, and that actually people are getting dopamine hits.
Yeah.
Well, as all three look at me there, I can categorically say no, I am not addicted. But there is absolutely something in what you say there, Nicola. It is a feel-good factor when you share something, when you post on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, when you get a reshare, or on Twitter a retweet, and that does feel really good, and that is a form of feedback. But after 24 hours, it's gone.
Yeah, and I completely support that. I mean, as we've established, I'm not a millennial, but I've absolutely adopted those platforms, apart from Snapface or whatever it's called.
Snapchat.
Okay, sorry.
Hashtag millennial.
Hashtag whatevs. But it's true. If you post something and nothing happens within a day, then you probably think, actually, I've done something wrong. Maybe it was an inappropriate thing that I posted. What is true is that millennials, latter millennials especially, and Gen Z, as we've said, are the first generation for whom it's completely normal. They live in a world, they've been brought up in a world where actually sharing things, liking things in real time with anyone, anytime, anywhere on the planet is possible. And so their expectations of work are very, very different. But if I recall when I first started work many years ago, I was taught how to give and receive feedback. And the model I was taught was BOOST, which is all feedback should be balanced, observed, objective, specific and timely, and that last bit, timely, is really, really important. There's no point giving someone feedback on something they've done 3 months later. So actually maybe this instant gratification, this thing where things happen really fast, is to the benefit of everybody in the workforce.
So that's right, Luke. Thinking about how technology has evolved to support the this, if you like, this instant giving and receiving of likes and dislikes. We progressed quite quickly from an internal email system to an external global email system, and that's quickly became the de facto way in which we would communicate and share things in the workplace. It was sort of very interesting talking to my teenage daughter last week about email, and she said, "Dad, nobody uses emails anymore."
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and I've actually heard that many, many times where people are saying that their kids just don't use email, and we actually see new people joining the workforce who, they've been brought up on different platforms. Suddenly they arrive at work, and suddenly they've got a massively important system. And actually, maybe we should think about where feedback might be appreciated or expected in the workplace. If somebody's coming in, they spend a couple of hours crafting a really special email to a load of stakeholders, and they get no response. then that might actually have a real negative impact on performance, on what people think, especially if then, like you mentioned earlier, that early career stage where you need a little bit more validation than later on when you've got more maturity. And I think we take for granted, so at Questback, we take for granted every single email we send has a little smiley rating thing at the bottom, which is part of this whole rise of peer-to-peer feedback. You know, being able to give instant feedback to somebody. Just someone sends you a great email, even if you got it at 11 o'clock at night and you happen to be browsing your phone before you go to bed, you can quickly punch a smiley face and say, that was great. It's a thumbs up. Someone else might sleep more, sleep more soundly at night because they know that people thought it was a good email.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leads on very nicely to speaking about positive feedback. But what happens when that feedback isn't so positive? And exactly to your example there, Luke, when it isn't positive and it's negative, how do we deal with that? Because there's an element of commitment and resilience in there.
Well, let me just throw a few numbers in here as we look at resilience. Apparently 80% of millennials want feedback, but only 14% will actively ask for feedback. And there's certainly a hypothesis there that this is because those millennials are worrying about whether that feedback will be negative or not. And so that's holding them back in asking for that. And I guess, if I think about, as I've gone through my career, I've certainly become more resilient to feedback, and will take positive and negative feedback when it comes along and listen to it and act upon it.
Yeah, going back to what you said there about that hypothesis, I haven't actually seen anything to support that. That doesn't mean that it isn't true, but I wonder if actually it's even more simpler than that. And if I'm a millennial or a Gen Zer and I'm new into the workplace, maybe I just don't feel comfortable going to my manager and asking him or her to change what has been a traditional way of working for a long period of time just for my benefit.
You're asking for feedback. Personally, you want feedback because you want to get better at your job. You're new in your career. But going to your boss, and I'm looking over here at Luke, our performance reviews in 6 months? I've got time.
Something like that, yeah.
Good.
We'll do one more, but we're into continuous performance assessments, obviously.
Oh, terrific. Well, you're asking the hand that feeds you, in effect, for possibly negative feedback. And if that negative feedback worries you, are you thinking, what's this mean for my job? What's this mean for my security? Importantly, what does this mean for my beer fund and going out on a Friday night?
Well, it's good to know that's where you're concerned. I mean, I think. So, I mean, this is actually the first useful message of the crosstalk that's coming out.
It's taken us 15 minutes to get
possibly. I haven't been counting, but as Scott said, if 80% of this, of a growing part of your workforce now actually wants feedback, but only 14% are prepared to ask for it, regardless of why that is. It could be either reason that we've explored today. There's a gap there that we need to close. So maybe it's the responsibility of organizations, leaders, to actually proactively start to close that gap, to look for tools and mechanisms and technologies that can help people to just share a little bit more readily, not just from this command and control down, but from side to side and up and down.
Yeah, and I think something that you mentioned, Martin, commitment and resilience, and we've looked at resilience, and I think there is a connection between resilience and commitment. But just thinking about commitment for a moment, how can you observe that? How do you measure it? And some people might say, well, somebody who works 70 hours a week or even 6 days a week, they're really committed. Or somebody who stayed with a business for 20 years, they're really committed. I guess we all know people that have been with the business 10 or 15 or 20 years and maybe coasting off toward retirement. So, maybe another way of thinking about commitment is just how hard does somebody work? And as a result of that, what impact do they have on the business? And, one sure sign of commitment, I think, at least, is if you're prepared as an individual to drive change in a business, then you're very much committed to the success of that business. So thinking about commitment in those terms, I think, gives us a slightly different view of it, perhaps.
One of the things I'll pick up on there, so we've spoken a little bit there about the willingness to stay, so commitment over a duration of time, but also how able we are maybe to cope with being on the same kind of job for a long period of time, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or whatever. But certainly I've seen no research to suggest that millennials in particular, if we focus on that group, are working any less hard than any other generation. In fact, if anything, all the research shows the contrary. They're working as hard, if not harder, than other generational cohorts. And also, I think what millennials want, and this comes out in every piece of research. They want job security, they want meaningful work, and I think there's this rise towards portfolio thinking. They want to stay with an organization for a long time, but they're also impatient and they want to see fast success. And those are the things actually that sometimes organizations fail their new employees because of sometimes just the simple organizational hierarchy prohibits that kind of rapid movement from one job to another or one task to another within the same organization. So it's not necessarily that they won't want to stay, but that maybe they'll cope less well also with doing the same task for any long period of time.
Curious to know what Martin thinks about that. Martin, any thoughts?
Sorry about that. I was just looking at Lad Bible, a pig cooling down in a giant bath.
Oh, wow.
And utterly relevant to the topic of millennials.
I think we're just seeing a real-time example of the basic human ability to switch context.
Yes, right. Well, getting back to the topic at hand, we're looking at the changing nature of the relationships between employees and employers. Nicola, talk to me about relationships.
So maybe if we narrow the focus down and think about millennials, there is a lot in the headlines that tells us that millennials have difficulty forming meaningful relationships, but I do think that we need to be a little bit careful about the context with how we look at that, because I think we tend to look at it through the lens of how we ourselves have formed relationships in the past. And I'm sure I'm not alone in having that experience where you go to a restaurant, there's a table of young people all having dinner together and everybody's head down looking at a phone. I see that. My initial thought is, what is wrong with these people? Put the phone down, get back in the room, engage with the people that you're talking with or that you're dining with. But for all I know, they are all interacting and talking to each other, but via some sort of application on this device in their hand. And maybe they're actually being even more inclusive because they've got people in this group chat that weren't able to make that dinner engagement. So we need to be a little bit careful. Having said that, there is a reasonable amount of evidence to suggest that fewer millennials are in long-term committed relationships than any generation in the past. I read that 64% of 18 to 29-year-olds are not living with or married to a partner. And I think there is this sort of image of, the millennials and the Gen Zers swiping right or left, because I'm not actually sure which one means that I like that
right.
person. Thank you, Martin. Store that one away for future reference.
Talking about relationships.
But, I think there's this image of them, swiping right, having all of these hookups, all this casual sex. But again, that isn't actually backed up by the research either. What it does tell us is that there's a lot of internet contact, but actually this isn't tending to progress to actual offline relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting. So something you mentioned, while we're on the subject of relationships and newer generations, older generations, offline, online, what I've heard is that millennials are sort of this first generation that's starting to blur the lines between personal life and work life. And I don't see that as being, are they really? Or is it just the fact that now, while I'm sitting at home with my wife sitting next to me on the sofa, at the same time I might get an alert, I'll have a look and I've got a WhatsApp from a colleague just sharing a picture or something.
Yeah, sorry about that, Luke.
That's okay. I just can't unsee it.
I think actually you sort of raised two things there. One is this sort of blurring of the boundaries between work and personal, so maybe we can come back to that. And the other is it really any different? Aren't they just forming these relationships, but through devices and applications? Maybe they are, and I don't actually know if what I'm about to say is true, but maybe it's this virtual nature though of these relationships that is some way impinging this ability for them to become deep and meaningful, potentially. I don't know. But what we do know for certain is that millennials definitely want relationships. They understand the importance to them in terms of the workplace. I read that 1/3 of millennials believe that socialising with their co-workers will help them move up the ladder, compared to just 5% of baby boomers, although maybe that's because the baby boomers are already at the top of the ladder. And back to your point about this sort of blurring of work-personal relationships, 28% of millennials have texted a manager out of work hours on a non-work related issue, compared to only 10% of baby boomers. So, but I think, when we think about these relationship issues, if there really are issues, I don't think we should hone in on the millennials. I think we should just look at this as a multi-generational context that we need to address. And I think, all of these different generations have different expectations about the nature of working relationships and the acceptable boundaries within which they operate. But there are some great examples of organisations that are really encouraging these cross-generational relationships, and Coca-Cola are a great example of this. They're one of the world's largest private sector employers of millennials. They comprise about 35% of the current workforce. And they've created something called the Millennial Voices Group. And it's a group of high-performing millennials who work on projects to support the company's strategic priorities. But what they also do is this concept of reverse mentoring. So the millennials actually mentor senior leaders within the organisation, and they help to encourage more of an open dialogue, but also just expose these different generations to the different perspectives that they've got.
I think that's fantastic. And now I have this picture in my head of a load of senior leaders at Coca-Cola going around with Snapchat.
And I've just made a note not to send any more outside of work memes to your WhatsApp, Luke. I think we've covered a lot here, and it's been really good so far, but I want to bring it back to what those original points were. And I've scribbled them down here, and it was around this instant gratification, commitment and resilience in relationships. So let's briefly go into those. Luke, what should business leaders do about millennials wanting instant gratification?
So I think if you now have a significant proportion of your workforce that expects to share all the time, I think they need to be enabled. I think they expect a sort of environment of transparency and trust. In fact, anything less than a culture of transparency and trust will lead to frustration and job hunting. So actually we need to start embedding feedback mechanisms into everyday working life, enabling peer-to-peer feedback so we can give feedback on work items quite quickly and easily so we know what we're doing is good and we can tell other people what we think. But also enabling managers and empowering managers so that actually they can get feedback from people around them on important projects, on other things that might affect their teams, rather than this just focusing on the command and control top-down feedback, which is still very important. But I think we're starting to move beyond that. I think that's very important.
Brilliant. And we've spoken about earlier on in the show when feedback is negative and when it isn't so good. Scott, over to you. What can business leaders do around commitment and resilience within the workplace?
I think the first thing on commitment is to recognise that millennials are just as committed as every generation, before and after. They certainly are very much very hard working. And so that's the first thing. Treat everybody, the same as far as commitment is concerned. I think the second thing is a little bit more individual. Resilience starts within us, and we have to learn as individuals to be able to take feedback, positive and negative, listen to it, and act upon it. I think those two things, as we said, do go together, and that's what I'd suggest for commitment and resilience.
Terrific. Lastly but not leastly, Nicola, we also spoke about relationships, and what can organisations do to help millennials build strong multi-generational relationships at work? Can they?
Yes, they absolutely can. But just really quickly to pick up on something that Scott was saying there about this generation being just as committed as any other generation. I have this image in my mind, when the hippies were just coming into the workplace of these, elderly gentlemen in suits going, good God, are these people going to, cut their hair, shave, dress properly, and what does this mean for our business? So I'm sure there's been the same, concerns every time a new generation comes into the workforce. But back to that concept of sort of building strong multi-generational relationships, I think that we definitely can do things to help that, and we need to think outside the boundaries of just immediate teams and think about their relationships across the organisation as a whole. And I think we need to acknowledge that millennials and Gen Zers are potentially coming into the workforce and operating in a way that we're not used to, maybe even that we're not comfortable with. They're potentially crossing boundaries, maybe utterly disregarding traditional hierarchies. But I think this is something that managers and leaders need to embrace rather than hinder. And I think what it ultimately will lead to is the need for organisations to become flatter, more fluid and more responsive, and more onus on leaders to communicate in an open, honest and frequent fashion. And I think the other thing that we can do, and we talked about those differing expectations within the generations. Now, the reality is we're all individuals, however Luke's Venn diagram appears. The reality is each of us probably have a unique positioning across those three different classifications and things that make us different. And wherever possible, we need to adapt our HR processes and practices to accommodate those individual attributes. And I think we've made great strides towards that when we look at things like mass customization. Yeah. So we're starting to see that really tailoring of processes, of packages and so forth to the individual. And then, not wishing to promote Coca-Cola, so Pepsi is also a fantastic beverage. But, I did think that reverse mentoring was fantastic. And, I think that doesn't have to necessarily just be senior leaders to millennials. I think whatever we can do within the organisational hierarchy, and that maybe is that sort of flattening of it, to create situations where people can have relationships across all the different generations and really learn from each other's strengths, because everybody's got them.
Yeah, so I guess in short, ultimately, if you now have such a large proportion of your workforce that does expect to share all of the time, then just embrace that.
Like a hug.
Exactly.
Fantastic. All of today's discussions do make me think of a JFK quote that I read earlier in the week, and that is, the future promise of any nation can be directly measured by the present prospects of its youth.
Nice.
The 3 things I've taken away from today's show: firstly, put mechanisms in place to support and promote peer-to-peer feedback. Secondly, encourage leaders to communicate openly and honestly, and importantly, frequently. And finally, initiatives like reverse mentoring to get different generations learning from each other. We'd absolutely love to have your thoughts and feedback, so please do drop us a line at jointhedebate@questback.com. A massive thank you to our panelists, our resident hippie, our 2 slackers, and above all, the millennial holding the whole thing together.
So he thinks.
And thank you to all of our guests. We really look forward to having you on the show next time. Do tune in.